Well, we're here to discuss Hack Your Writing, which is the fourth make cycle of the Connected Learning Massive Open Online Course, or collaboration, that's the better word. This is a sort of playful concept, this notion of hack, and introduced in a more broader sense than just the computer programmer subversive sense. So before we jump into a discussion of what hack your writing might mean, I think we should introduce ourselves. So I'll start with myself. I'm Mia Zamora. I'm from the Kane University Writing Project, and I'm happy to be facilitating this week's Hack Your Writing make cycle. Michelle, do you want to pick up with the intros?
I am Michelle Stein, and I am a middle school teacher from Atlanta, and this is my first MOOC and my first panel sitting on a Google Hangout, so just encourage everyone, if you've never done it, give it a try.
Deanna, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Deanna Maskley, and I'm the director for the Moorhead Writing Project in Kentucky.
Chris?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Lawrence. I am the director, or some such, of the Mozilla WebMaker community and the Hive Learning Network community. Glad to be here.
And Amy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm Amy Clancy, and I am a middle school teacher. This is my 15th year, and I'm also the editor for the Kentucky Council Teachers of English newsletter.
Great. So thank you guys so much for joining in this conversation. I hope we can generate some ideas around what hack your writing might mean. I think it's something that might mean different things to different people, and I'm all for that openness and a variety of varying interpretations, etc. But I just wanted to start off by suggesting that when I first thought of the idea, I was coming from a perspective of the notion of writing is always making. And I'm very intrigued by the ways in which our writing process and our writing practices have transformed with 21st century learning tools, digital tools, etc. So what kinds of new affordances do we gain with different digital tools, and how might that transform the writing process? So when I put out the call for hackers, I kind of had in mind a loose interpretation of what hacking might mean, but also, of course, understanding that it has a kind of history to it and a connotation to it. But really what I'd like to do is embrace the spirit of remix and exploration and innovative customization. And then, of course, I wanted to also see what might emerge in our community regarding the notion of subversion and hacking towards collective action and notions of transforming community practice, etc., because that is, of course, one of the connotations pinned to the word. But maybe what we can do now is just have a little bit of a conversation about what the first impressions were around that word of hacking, because not all feel comfortable with that word. That's already come up in the Google chat space a little bit. I saw some postings that maybe it isn't the right word for what it is we're trying to do, and I thought that would be a nice place to start, sort of vexing the word, and then after that maybe we can share out some examples of the kind of work we've been doing as a response to the call. Does anyone have any first impressions or first thoughts of the term or the formulation hack your writing? And you know, Chris, maybe you could pick up on this coming from your perspective of someone who's providing tools for so many writers out there. You know, the word hack, do you see that as a useful formulation for thinking about writing these days?
Certainly. So the short answer would be yes. I think it's interesting in terms of the word hack and writing. You know, I think writing. Well, one, I think it's super important in technology that we still talk very much about a read-write culture in terms of being the empowerment model around technology. So we still very much use that terminology, the taxonomy of literacies is still very much applicable to that. So I get really excited when, you know, so much of reading and writing is lost sometimes, and especially in the recent technological culture. Over the, you know, if you think about media over the last 60 to 70 years, it's been mostly read, right? And so where the write part has been deeply stripped out of it, even though that when you think about whether it's the printing press or just the written word, that sort of remixable hackability has always been ingrained in writing. And I think we're actually at the point now when we're starting to enact our will, so to speak, or our desire to be in a read-write culture onto technology and kind of reconnect to that. So I actually think that reading and writing is actually that instinct that people have through those kind of text-based literacies is what we're starting to be an empowerment model through technology. So I'm super excited about that. But also, you also look at some, you know, classic writing has always been this kind of remix and hackable culture. You know, even if you think of someone like a William Burroughs or these other folks that were actually using this kind of, you know, writing styles, that's always sort of been embedded in some, you know, poets and writers and even journalists. So to me, reading and writing is still in the vanguard of how we should think about technology. I guess that would be my opening salvo.
Yeah, I love your point. I'm with you on that. Does anyone want to jump in with some further reflections on Chris's ideas?
This is Michelle, and I'd like to share a little bit of information that I gleaned from attending the MyCon conference in Memphis in June, and I sat in on a session where we were talking about how writing has changed for this generation of students. It's not this; they're not doing the same kind of writing that I did in school, and what's the worth of a 5-paragraph essay in the context of how we are communicating now? So I've been thinking in terms of how does the way that students will need to communicate going forward differ from the type of writing that I was taught. And I think that there's a great deal more value in the kind of writing that Chris alluded to than what I grew up having to write. The only people who will have to write a 5-paragraph essay coming out of college are the people who are going to be writers. No one else is going to have to do that kind of writing. So being able to shorten, abbreviate, interpret is much more critical a skill than organizing a lengthy piece. And it was a really interesting conversation with some excellent resources from the seminar instructor.
That's interesting. Formulaic argumentation is perhaps, so Michelle's point is that formulaic argumentation is passe in an era when we have so much facility with the tools to develop argumentation. So thanks for sharing that insight. Does anybody else want to throw out some comments about hacking as a kind of entry point for writing these days in the educational context?
Well, I tend to think that our students are hacking their writing much more than they're doing the traditional writing that we tend to think of, that they're writing on, you know, writing on and about and through games and popular culture, and you know, it seems to me that that's a much easier entry point to introduce them through hacking their writing, you know, hacking the 5-paragraph essay versus making them write the traditional 5-paragraph essay. And you know, that's one of the things that just this morning when I was working on my own piece for this hacking our own writing for my make, I was reflecting on what an interesting lens it was just to work on my writing using a different medium. And it really made me think line by line about the poem that I was working on, much more so than if I'd done some other kind of traditional revision process. And I think that's a tool that we really need to do more to harness.
Amy, do you have some ideas you want to share? I see that in the chat roll you talked a little bit about testing and, you know, the reality for teachers in the classroom and, you teaching writing versus an intuitive entry point for writing that might be culturally current?
Well, I think probably the biggest thing that that I have taken away from the Hack Your Writing and some of the ideas that have been presented and that I've participated in has been really getting students interested in seeing the different kinds of writing that can be done, motivation for students. That's the angle that I would take, would be to use these types of tools, like the hypertext writing and so on, to really show students that there's a lot of different kinds of writing that can be done. I'm really moving away from the state test type writing this year. I'm taking, in my opinion, I'm taking a big leap of faith in that if we learn different kinds of writing and we practice together, that it will transfer over into what needs to be done for that state test. And I believe that. And I think that the ideas that I've learned, particularly through the Hack Your Writing and a lot of the different tools, can really help kids get excited about writing and also motivate them and just introduce them to a world that probably up until, and they're 8th graders, up until this point, they probably have not seen. Most of the writing that they have seen has been open response and portfolio style writing pieces, which has been that formulaic writing. And I think that our students need to get past that in order to be of value in our work world and in our future. But there's a part of me that fears that, because we've got the new professional growth and evaluation system going on, and everything that happens in the classroom is going to determine whether or not I'm considered an effective teacher.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, go, Shyam, go ahead. And first of all,
sorry,
maybe
Sam, by the way, I'm so sorry.
Shyam, I'm sorry.
No.
Introduce yourself first, because
my
we
name,
didn't.
My name is Sam.
I
I write SHYAM, but it's pronounced like Sam. But I'm a teacher, assistant professor at Stony Brook University here in New York. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sorry again that I was late. I was taking care of 2 little kids, and then time flew. I didn't realize I was late. Can I quickly add something in terms of hacking that I've been thinking about this week? I'm thinking about what I call reverse hacking. And by reverse hacking, I mean a lot of times when our students have certain conceptions about writing, and then we need to sort of challenge that, help them to redefine, rethink, inspire them to think that writing is interesting, inspire them to take writing in the hard, difficult way, to slow down, read carefully, cite effectively, be responsible when you're citing other sources. And I'm also thinking reverse hacking in the sense of teaching to sort of not assuming that students are constantly moving forward in this world of technology progress, so that students are on the one hand writing more and more and more. They may also be writing more variety of types of writing, and they may also be doing more thinking and communicating. And yet at the same time, I'm beginning to teach a summer course, and yesterday in the first class, one of my students said, when I was encouraging them to go to the library, he said, "Why do I need to go to the library?" And I had to give them a long lecture about Western civilization and the body of knowledge that it has built over the last 3,000 years. Only 20, 40 years of that knowledge has been translated, and it is not organized and presented in the same effective way that the library has developed in the last 500 years. It may take time. We're not doing that. Both are complementary to each other, right? So by reverse hacking, then I mean sort of addressing students' misconceptions, helping them to adapt new techniques so that they don't give up on some of the things that we have always done, critical thinking and citing effectively, and those kinds of things. Policing, editing when policing and editing is important.
Is there a specific example you might be able to throw out in terms of an assignment or something? Because I'm very intrigued by that.
Okay, I'll give you a very good example. A lot of times when students are reading something for class, they tend to sometimes just respond. And instead of really taking the time to engage with the outside source, when they're doing research-based writing and argument, they just pick whatever is useful to them, they run with it, right? And I have an assignment called the discussion argument. It sounds paradoxical, but let me explain. Students must take a topic and read 10 to 15 sources on it, taking notes, trying to understand the different perspectives, different issues, different contexts, different types of evidences, different types of arguments that the authors are making on a particular topic. For example, college cost and is college worth it? But they're not allowed to take their own position and start filtering information. They have to slow down and summarize and say, here are 5 different perspectives on the issue of college cost and whether it's worth it. Here's one group of people that look at it from this direction, another group of people looking from that perspective, and in that way they are supposed to explore, understand, and present the holistic discussion as it is. Their argument, if any, is only to prove how complicated and multidimensional and the ongoing debate, discussion on the subject is. So that basically takes the idea of making an argument in a one direction and trying to prove before you actually learned enough about the subject.
I see. So the reverse comes from the research, basically. Exactly. That's the notion of the reversal.
It becomes painful and confusing because it's easy. And then students begin to realize, aha, it's very important that I first understand all of these perspectives before I can. Then the second assignment or follow-up assignment is now take your argument and now make your argument and develop it. Anyway, I've talked too much.
No, I'm glad that you fleshed that out further because I was very curious about the notion of the reversal involved. How about sharing out further examples of how people are approaching this notion of hacking within our own community of practice? I know many of you have posted things on the Google board that are really great. So does anyone want to share out angles on or perspectives on this? Amy, you've done some great work on the board. You want to start by maybe the visual poetry. That was great stuff.
Yeah, I just really thought, well, what can we do online with writing? And so I just kind of went on and started investigating some online writing tools, and I love poetry, and I found a couple of them, but I wasn't really happy with it, and stumbled on the visual poetry and thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. And I was able to, copy and paste in one of the poems that I wrote, and just play around with it. I am not artistic, so I ended up doing this spiral thing, and I'm sure my thought was the kids would be able to take their poem and they could create something so much better because they're so creative. What I thought was really cool about that is that really invokes a higher order thinking, because in a degree you've got your kids writing this poem, and then you have kids now who are planning what shape should this poem take,
Exactly.
what form should this take, and I see that as taking that simple poem writing exercise to a different level.
Another level.
And I even noted, because I'm kind of writing a blog on that, I noted that kids, in writing workshop even, that might be a tool that a teacher will use when that student says, hey, I'm finished. And I say that with quotation marks, I'm finished. That would be a really cool tool that a teacher might direct a student to take that poem to a higher level if it was not done as a whole class, or if they were limited on computers in the classroom. So I loved that tool, and there's a lot of different ways it could be done, but I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think your point about 2 entry points of representation that they need to sort of shape and make and consider, obviously the text itself, the language, the use of language in poetry, but then also the visuality and the kind of representative meaning that is framed by creating an image as much as, which, as Chris pointed out earlier in his introductory commentary, has been, an exploration for writers for some time now. This isn't new, but the digitization of that is a new kind of entry point. And we have these tools that kids can enter into this engagement with that might open things up and excite them, which is a bit what we were talking about a little bit earlier too, is the ways in which hacking might expand entry point for writing and writing creatively for our students. Michelle said something that I think is really important that maybe we could talk about for a little bit, and that's she's wondering about the idea of whether hacking is taking without permission. And I think the whole kind of concept of plagiarism, you could even consider the notion of hacking, if you're hacking your own writing, as a kind of plagiarism of self, which I think is a fascinating sort of proposition. But maybe we could wax reflective on the notion of, kind of copy and imitation and remixing as sort of dangerous territory of reiteration without proper homage to the original. What are your thoughts on that these days?
The reason that I bring up this topic is because in middle school specifically, we are drilling into our students' heads why you can't just take an image and do anything you want to with it and to it. So why is it okay then to take writing and do whatever you want to with it, but it's not okay to take an image and do whatever you want to with it? So my thought process is, does writing fall into the same category, I guess, as anything that we would look under, a common sense license, a common Creative Commons license? And that's where my thought was coming from, and I'm interested to hear other opinions.
I'd be curious to see what was the rationale or what was the thinking behind the you can't alter a photograph. What was the thinking there? What was the explanation you give to your students?
Because you, depending on how it's licensed, you have to have permission. You can't just take any image you want to and do anything you want to it.
So then the deeper conversation is then following the use license, which could be similarly applied to other art forms, including writing. So to me, that's almost a literacy around search and around, whether it's fair use. So I think the teachable moments are, really around that. And then, searching. So then what permissions does a author, and I say author writ large, right? A creative person, a creative agent putting their work out, what has to now in this world has to start thinking about what are the permissions that they give, whether it's as heavy-handed as a Creative Commons license or just a statement that says, hey, use this, but that is part of our world now, is that when you put something out into the world, that you have to say how you want it to be used. So I think that's fascinating, and I also think that there's also a frame. Well, one, the digital world gives us a trail, right? So I think, and we have crowdsourcing, and those two things busts illegal use of other people's stuff much faster, and so it's actually much harder to get away with these things with those two things in concert. So it's a lot more difficult to actually get away with using people's stuff that they don't want you using. But two, I think we can frame it as Remix's conversation. I think that's the really interesting. That's the interesting frame around this, and that is not a new thing in the creative process, right? So I mean that's as old as the campfire, so to speak. So and if we use Remix's conversation, that's a different frame around the interaction of art.
I like that. Remix this conversation.
Can I ask a quick question about the idea? On one hand, it looks like when you're using an image, you're using the whole text. When we cite somebody else's writing, we don't take the whole text and put it into a context. We take part of it, and there's fair use, there's amount of use, right? There are ways of citing. But I'm also wondering, more philosophically speaking, if the idea of taking somebody's intellectual property, whether that's an image or an idea, a text, if that idea of the intellectual property being protected was based on scarcity, relative scarcity to need, right? But the internet has made content and media suddenly explode by thousands, maybe million-fold, so that now it's easy, right? It's things have it's much easier. It's things don't cost, let's say, the same way as they used to in the past. So there may be a cultural shift, right? So that the idea that you don't take somebody's picture is not the same thing as taking a picture from somebody's album. One, because of reproduction, any number of copies can be reproduced. Second, because of the explosion of content, there's just too much out there, and it doesn't feel like you're taking something away. I mean, there may be this kind of cultural shift, and then there may be a gap between what has happened in the real world and how we conceptualize intellectual property. Just have you thought about that? Maybe what makes it easier for students to hack, adapt, mix, remix, and use without thinking it's wrong. It's not like taking your picture. It's out
Certainly
there.
I was going to say, certainly the preciousness of the original seems to be something diminished in the cultural moment. But whether or not the ethics of remix and hacking as a writing practice is addressing that in an effective way and in a fair way is up for debate,
Yes.
I think.
Yep, that may remain the same.
Another aspect of remixing and hacking that I wanted to draw out is the notion of inherent subversiveness and implied critique. I think this is picking up a little bit on Chris's last point about remix as conversation. When one revisits and reiterates or introduces new elements to an original piece of representation, you know, how is it moving beyond just an effort to translate that? And is there a more, so Terry Elliott, one of our colleagues in CL MOOC and in the National Writing Project, really wrote a thoughtful Google post recently about this very idea of when does remix and hacking move towards a more authentic writing engagement and just away from a superficial reiteration or translation. And what are we looking for in a remix that would make it inherently anew and meaningful in powerful ways? I think that line is rather fine, and you know, I thought maybe we could weigh in on that idea a bit. Is what role does subversion play in the work of hacking? And you know, is there a point in which it moves to a new purpose? And how do we identify the embedded critique in a remix and say that is one that's worthwhile and meaningful? Because you could just move a few words around or throw in a couple of pictures and then say, okay, teacher, I did the hack you're writing, or you know, but is it a new production of meaning? Is it an artful critique? And where do we draw that line as educators who are pushing our students to think in complex ways?
Well, one of the classes that I teach is comic books, which opens up a lot of really interesting ideas to think of in terms of the remix, because I'm thinking about fan fiction, and you know, there's a lot of forums available online where people take a world that's been created by someone else and then they make stories that are original, but then take those characters and that world in those rules that someone else created and remix it in their own way. And sometimes it is a critique. I mean, just today I saw somebody had an alternate ending to the Harry Potter series.
That sounds fun.
Because they didn't like the way that, you know, J.K. Rowling ended it. And, you know, there's a lot of people who love to speculate, you know, for example, with The Walking Dead, you know, where are they going to go next? What's going to happen in these months when we're waiting for the next season to start? You know, we have to do something with all that fan energy. So it's not always an implied critique, I don't think. Sometimes it is. I don't know. I'm just thinking that there's a lot of room for a remix in new.
One thing I thought of when you mentioned this comment was about intent, And a lot of intent comes from the age of the student, because a student at younger ages, their only intent is going to be to accomplish whatever the teacher has asked them to do, until we get to a point in time where they have the creative ability to want to create purely for the love of creation. That happens a little bit later than the kids that I'm teaching. It's a little bit further down the road. But when you get to a little bit older students, creating for different intent is part of what enters the conversation. I truly believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, you know, what the Walking Dead analogy is so interesting, and about the conversation. You know, texts, whether they be television shows or movies or written word or things on the web, you know, they can't. There is now this conversation around all of these releases of art, or, you know, whatever, that can't be controlled, right? That's it's not that the cat's out of the bag, so to speak. You know, Clay Shirky has that great quote. Let me pull it up. You know, the sort of the people formerly known as the audience, and that's
Yeah.
not going to be recurtated, right? That's going to be put back in the box. And I think that the texts, you know, writ large, that actually engender this conversation, whether that leaves things open-ended or it invites fan participation, it puts in the Easter eggs. I mean, you know, those are the things that resonate with people, and those are the things that, like, actually, you know, you could make an argument that narrative has never been more alive, you know, I mean, especially in like a kind of modern context in the last 60 or 70, 80 years. I mean, we have whole groups involved in these discussions about narratives and whether they're continuing the narrative or commenting on the narrative or recapping the narrative. I mean, it's just that nothing that puts out into the world just stays static. You know, doesn't mean it's being remixed, or we don't always have to go into like a plagiarism stage, but there is a conversation around almost anything out in the world. And in fact, the things that are released that are dead rooms, right, that don't have conversations, those are the things that don't have legs, you know. So, or we can all do a wink and a nod that are kind of, you know, probably talking to an audience that if.
Oh, Chris froze. Did you guys hear the end of that? Or I think he's frozen. Well, I think his points were very good, but the whole notion of a participatory culture that cannot be denied at this point, and a cultural framework of remix that's so much a part of that participation. You know, so perhaps in this make cycle, as we think about that reality, we also think about the transformation of our writing process at this day and age, or in this day and age. One other thing, that when I was designing the newsletter for this make cycle, one of the things I wanted to sort of provoke was the balance and conversation around the analog and the digital in our practices these days. So Kevin Hodgson, another great National Writing Project colleague, he basically hacked the newsletter itself, and one of the points he made was that hacking can happen anywhere, and you don't need a computer to do it. You know, remix is a sensibility that, you know, isn't bound to the digital.
Pre-existed, yeah.
Exactly, and what an important and significant point he made in that moment of the hack of the newsletter. But one of the things I was thinking as I was moving through the kind of provocation and prompts was, how do we balance our analog practices with our digital reality, and where can we see that tinkering of a balance in our teaching practices, in our writing practices, etc. Another thing that kind of I want to tag on to that, and then I'll throw it out to you guys in your reflections, is the process of composing. Has composing been transformed because there are these two entry points, the analog and the digital? That's an important question for us to consider, I think, as well as educators and as writers. So I wondered if you guys had any thoughts about that.
Can I quickly share one or two thoughts about the digital and the and the new analog and digital? like the conversation with a student who insisted for a while that the library is no longer useful in a college classroom yesterday. I think the point is to explain to students, to communicate, and to help them realize that everything has its own affordances, right? The pen has its affordances. You can put it in your pocket and go. You can write on your palm, on the back of your hand, whatever. Remember Sarah Palin. If you understand the affordances and the upsides and downsides of each of these technologies, the chances of a student not taking something seriously, the chances of a student not recognizing and acknowledging and building multiple skills is lower. Some time ago, to give you a concrete example, some time ago there was a high-tech technology chief information officer, something like that, in the university, who gave a wonderful 1.5-hour lecture on how students are moving from here to there. They don't care about privacy. They are sharing everything, and they fire up Twitter, and they start engaging with the world in the classroom. And he finishes that 1.5-hour talk. I consider myself quite tech savvy, and I was sitting there thinking, what is he doing? He's basically bashing teachers who seem to be not willing to jump on all those bandwagons whenever they develop, right? And then two things happened. One was a wonderful professor that I know raises her hand and she goes, "So-and-so, is there any hope for us?" And I felt like going to that wonderful teacher and say, "Please don't ask this question. We could be the hope or part of the hope, and they could be part of the hope. We should put those two together." The second, one gentleman was angry. He stood up and said, "If you could do all of this via Twitter, why did you invite us here and gave us a 1-hour talk using your mouth and keeping us seated here like this?" And that started a really nice conversation. I use Twitter a lot in my class. I use Facebook, Twitter, all kinds of things. But sometimes I say, turn that off because, or turn that on because. Here's why we are doing this. And somebody pointed out during that discussion that there are 4 generations of people in the workplace today, from the 70-year-old, 75-year-old person who is still not able to retire, to the person who is always like that, right? And so our students continue to need the ability to work with 4 generations of people. They continue to need the ability to relate to the people around the world. I'm engaged in a lot of international communities of teachers and learners and communities, educational communities, and every time when somebody's assuming from one country that Twitter is the norm, somebody else like, what's Twitter? Right? What's Twitter? And so I think culturally speaking, generationally speaking, digital and analogically wise speaking, we need to expand our horizons, and I think that we need to start that by understanding and recognizing the affordances, the importance and the complementary nature and the value, what happens when we're able to bring all those together and realize what does what and what doesn't do what. I think that's how I would start in terms of your question of balance.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about the balance between analog and digital tools and how we approach these 2 entry points when thinking about our writing?
Well, I think it's important to remember that hacking the writing does not necessarily mean it has to be digital hacking. You know, the old ransom note kind of, poetry writing is still hacking your writing. You can go very old school and hack.
Thank you. That's
one of the ideas I had was, I hope to share the whole notion of the found poetry as well, just the words around us and how they appeal to us, and rethinking the mundane and infusing it with a kind of interpretive meaning by arranging them in particular ways, which is precisely what found poetry is. So that's an example of a kind of low-tech or analog hacking entry point. How about some other, manifestations of hacking that we've seen on the Google board, or that people are drumming up that I might not be aware of, that are beyond the Google board. What have you guys noticed? Anything from what has been manifest there?
I was thinking about.
I'm thinking.
Sorry.
Oh, Michelle, you want to?
No, I was just. My lens is younger. It sounds like than several of the other panelists, and I'm seeing a great deal of what we would classify as hacking or remixing in the form of parody, because that's a favorite form of the age group. And it's a wonderful way for the students to learn what's safe, how to be funny without being hurtful, and they are learning a great deal from making parodies of magazines, of skits that they see on television. We did a parody of a newspaper that took the faculty, and the students wrote hoaxes. So hoaxes, and the whole genre of hoaxes is a great remix of truth versus fiction that teaches the value of authenticity, and we use that to teach to validating sources. So again, I think it depends a great deal on the age level.
I really found fascinating Amy's, talking about hyperlinked copy or writing. This idea that, that's something we somewhat take advantage of, or sorry, sorry, I got caught up. That we sort of we assume we're sort of used to, right? Hypertext writing, but what a revolution that is. That writing becomes linkable, that becomes surfable, that becomes instantly referenceable. And so I was really taken with Amy's post on the G+ site, kind of exploring what that means when you add hypertext, to writing, and it sort of breeds serendipity, it breeds intentionality. It really, that kind of what that's done for writing, I think is still something that we're scratching the surface of what that's actually meant for the practice of writing and publishing.
One of my current loves in terms of my own research is the genre of electronic literature, and the hypertext narrative is a profound genre in which layered webs and complex structures are developed for a narrative engagement, in which ultimately the reader is producing the meaning, because it is so layered and complex. There are so many links that take you to so many sophisticated and complicated places. Just imagine this: if a story started out with one paragraph, and then within that paragraph there were 5 choices of links, and then each of those 5 links led to 5 links, and each of those 5 links led to 5 links. So just imagining that kind of complex web, essentially the reader gets lost and is very disoriented in a hypertext experience of that level of complexity, but also the reader is now the one producing meaning in the most explicit sense, because their choices, every time the text is read, a new text is discovered. In my electronic literature class with some of the most sophisticated hypertext fiction, every single person in the class it was like a commitment to read for 3 hours a certain text, and every single one of us, the 25 of us, read an entirely different story and encountered entirely different people, characters. There were some characters that overlapped, but what happened to them and the unfolding of the plot was very different in each context. So at that stage, when it gets to that kind of level of structural complexity, we're pushing back on traditional forms of what we expect out of a narrative, right? And new things are coming up. So I love the affordances, to use that word, that come from the digital space, because it presents all kinds of new artistic possibility and brings the reader in a very active role as well. So Chris started out with some really smart comments about reading and writing. And I think that both of those activities, i.e. an equative literacy, are kind of exponentially charged by the affordances that come with digital computation.
As you were talking about the hypertext narratives, I was thinking about reading postmodern fiction and earlier 20th century British and American literature and the trends and movements. And I always wonder how today's digital literature, digital technologies, and these trends in creative kinds of writing may be influenced by earlier developments. And sometimes I wonder if our students and we even read and think and explore those connections enough today. I think our teaching and learning would be richer if we were to go into the theoretical underpinning, the historical and the cultural foundations of how these kinds of new modes of creative writing and communication is done. I'm afraid sometimes, maybe I'm beginning to sound very old or something. I'm afraid sometimes that we may be leaving behind the interest in looking at the foundations and looking at the trends. I don't know, it could be just me. It's moving away from the understanding the theoretical, philosophical, cultural, social underpinnings of the things that we do, because the things are so engaging in themselves that the underlying value systems or histories or philosophies or approaches sort of become less interesting to us. I'm just throwing that thought out there.
Thoughts, guys? I was thinking that at least within the context of exploring what it is that makes a text literary, which is a lot of the work I do as a literature professor, that conversation always brings us back to derivation and roots and former traditions that are being played at and remixed, etc., even with new affordances that come with the digitized world. So in that sense, there is a kind of reaching deep that comes with remix and exploration. But that's a challenge as well, because it's not necessarily apparent to students what is being riffed or what is being critiqued, which is part of our comments about like entry points, like parody, etc. You know, when Michelle mentioned parody, I was thinking to myself, that is an excellent assignment for a young student to enter into remix through parody. But there probably are more effective parodies in the group than there are, and less effective ones, because some are just sort of imitating while others sort of have a sophisticated critique. And that's what I was kind of, you know, pointing to or trying, you know, I was thinking about earlier in our conversation, because I thought that nexus, that the difference between those two engagements is really important in terms of what we're trying to do as educators in thinking about argumentation and the critical thinking, etc. How do we see those distinctions? How do we draw them out? And how do we have students notice those distinctions when hacking writing pieces? Those questions are not easily answered, just important questions to ask as educators, I think.
But I think they're very important questions, because like they lead you while engaging people in fun, creative, sort of, what is that term? Not dissident, but anyway, sort of irreverent ways of engaging with original text, so that you're not dominated by certain structures. You're kind of free to break. You're free to adapt and you know, co-opt. I think they're very interesting. They're very interesting and productive ways of engaging students and taking them deeper into the thought, the foundations I was referring to earlier. I think that's an important point. Yeah.
I think Amy wrote something really important in our chat roll, and forgive me if I'm outing you, Amy, but she said that it depends on your intention as a writer, i.e. as a hacker, and then she admitted that when she was pursuing her creation of a found poem, she wasn't necessarily engaging in critique first and foremost, as she was, you know, I'm assuming, you know, you entered into the engagement as a playful kind of exploration, which I think is a completely valid, you know, entry point. I think, though, it's interesting what emerges when you enter with one intention, and then other things there's a richness to it beyond your intention, which is what all great art is, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely, Roland Barthes, wrote about the death of the author, and I think more than ever that paradigm is, here in the sense that the authorial intention of the work is not where the meaning is limited, and hacking just draws that out further, I think.
Don't you think teaching can be hacked by students if you think about the teacher's intention in the assignment objectives, assignment guidelines, assignment instructions? If students were able to hack that, if the students were able to take that in different directions. For example, I participated in this course called Rhizo 14 by Dave Cormier, and the people have gone in all kinds of directions, and after he announced that the course is over, most of the people actually started that course. The teacher was gone. and I'm thinking in the online world of collaboration and people coming in and going out as they like, the ideas of structure, intentions, objectives, guidelines, teacher-student relationship, authority, hierarchy, all of these things are kind of hacked and pulled apart. And that's when learning seems to happen a lot in interesting and creative ways, right? I'm thinking of trying to translate today's conversation into pedagogical thinking, where students may be able to hack your intentions and your assignments.
Yes, that leads me to a point that Kevin Hodgson made in the hacking of the newsletter as well, which I think was very important, which is, well, I wrote it down, so I'm going to quote it directly because I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to hack this quote from him. He said that, he asked a question. He said, do we value our students as hackers of their own education? I loved that reflective question, because I think on some level that is the heart of what we're talking about as well. The issue of the negotiation of power, authority, the points you made earlier, and what's our role as educators in the 21st century, in a moment of the possibility of network learning, self-directed learning, peer learning, etc. And hacking your writing plays into that culture as well. And yet, where does that leave us, in terms of imparting and guiding us to the future of our citizenry, our students, to think in complex and meaningful ways? How do we get there?
Well,
I see some light bulbs going on. So yeah, Deanna.
It's dangerous territory. One of the things we've talked about often at my institution, I'm an instructor, which means I have no power and no status. But on the other hand, it also allows me the freedom to do a lot in my classroom, to hack my classroom, and to give my students freedom to do things, to hack differently. Whereas if I was on the tenure track and they were looking at my syllabi and my assignments and my student writing much more closely, I could not be nearly as innovative as I am. And I know a lot of the K-12 teachers that I work with, it just depends on the district and their administration how much power they're able to give their students to hack. I know teachers that could not do as Amy's going to be doing this year in terms of teaching to the test, because they know they're going to have walkthroughs and they're going to have an administrator in their room saying, well, it's 8:15, why aren't you doing on-demand writing right now?
Right.
One of the things that I'm going to be incorporating this year is going to be Genius Hour, and in a way that's kind of what I think Cheyenne was talking about with that whole hacking the teaching position and becoming a teacher yourself. One of the things that really kind of struck me, and I was with Deanna in the Moorhead Writing Project, and as I was investigating and researching, and one of the statements that stood out to me was that school in the past, students went to school because that was the place to get knowledge, and that is no longer the case. And so that really resonated with me, in that my kids don't need to come to me to get knowledge anymore. They need to come to me for modeling. They need to come to me for some facilitated practice. They need to come to me to maybe provide the tools they need because they may not have them at home. I'm in a rural district. A lot of students don't have a computer at home. So that's probably the biggest change that I see that I'm attempting this year is that providing some flipped instruction so that they're not sitting in class and they're not getting lecture, and doing the activities in class with a facilitator to assist them, and then giving them time to actually hack the world of learning on their own terms in a genius hour kind of an atmosphere where they can learn what they want to learn and still produce some of the writings and the blog posts and the things that I want them to produce, but it'll be based on their own interests, and I'm excited.
You'll love it.
Yeah, I think they're coming to you and to so many gifted educators to learn how to think at this point. But it looks like we're out of time now. It's on the 8 o'clock hour. So I just want to thank everyone for such an interesting and dynamic conversation. And I suspect that that board will light up with all kinds of interesting hacks this week, and it will hopefully further support our innovative thinking in our teaching practices. So again, thanks everyone for sharing time with us.
This was great. Thank you.
This was fantastic. Very inspiring. Thank you.